All right, well, you know, it is a great pleasure today to be at the podium to introduce our next speaker. It's kind of interesting if in most states, in fact, I would argue probably in all states, but maybe a couple, if a plant manager says he's got a relationship with and knows the chief commissioner of environmental quality in the state, you would say, that ain't a good thing. In this particular situation, in this state, it is a very good thing. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Brian Shaw. Dr. Brian Shaw was appointed to the TCEQ, Texas Commission of Environmental Quality, by our governor at that time, Governor Rick Perry, in 2007, and was promoted to the commissioner in 2009. And Dr. Shaw is a professor at Texas A&M University. His no whoops in the crowd? Okay, there we go. All right. He has a number of specialties and really expertise. One is in emission factor development and dispersion modeling. So for most of you in the crowd, you think of emission factors and dispersion modeling, it means nothing to you. I would tell you, as someone that permits petrochemical plants, it is absolutely critical to the process of permitting and operating facilities. Dr. Shaw probably doesn't remember this. I would tell you, I certainly do. I first met him about 10 years ago, and we were giving congressional testimony. Now, for Dr. Shaw, that was probably no big deal. He wasn't nervous. That was water he swam in every day. For this guy, it was not water that I swam in every day, and I was very nervous. And he gave me some words of advice prior. I'll never forget that. I appreciated his knowledge and wisdom at that point in time, and still do today. Dr. Shaw has bachelor degrees and master's degrees from Texas A&M University. Thank you. And then after that, he made a little trip up north, actually. He has his doctorate from the University of Illinois, so we've got a little Big Ten influence there. So he spent some time up in Champaign-Urbana and received his doctorate degree in ag engineering. So with that, I would like to introduce to you Dr. Brian Shaw.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jim. Thank you, Jim, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. And I think Jim gives me more credit than he should, but I certainly appreciate that. I'll pay the usual fee, so thank you for that, Jim. So it is good to be here and good to be able to address this group. And after hearing Hector's discussion, you understand a lot of what good is happening in the state of Texas, especially from the standpoint of the economics that we have. And I'm going to talk about some of the issues that we deal with as a state agency and how things work in Texas, highlight some of the things that are working well, and hopefully it will spark or at least create some additional discussion about how we can continue to make that improvement. So I appreciate that. I hopefully will cover some of the things that make Texas a unique and special place. Obviously, there's a lot of things that don't just happen. In fact, if you are involved in some of the permitting, as Jim was talking about, I often say to myself or consider that it's pretty amazing, actually, that things ever get done and new projects get off the ground because of all of the requirements and the amount of time and investment, especially amount of time and investment when you don't know for sure that you're going to have some fruit at the end of that process. So it's something that we need to continue to work on. I'm also pleased to see that there are a number of students in the room, and I'll apologize, some of you have experienced this before, but as a recovering university professor at Texas A&M, as a recovering university professor from Texas A&M, there we go, thank you. I do tend to have that problem of speaking for 50 minutes at a time. Unfortunately for you, this is a Tuesday, Thursday, which means it's closer to an hour and a half. So I'll try to limit that, try to stick to the time frame I've been allotted, but obviously if it looks like I'm going long, somebody will come and get the hook and pull me off. I do appreciate the fact that we have students here and recognize that some of the process you're going through is preparing you to be the next great leaders for our state and economy. And as I often like to point out, it's not just doing good things from the standpoint of making jobs at the sacrifice of the environment, but we recognize in the state of Texas that we have to maintain a strong economy in order to continue protecting our environment. And I can't say this too often. If you look at some suggestions that it's a choice between the environment and the economy, I think those folks are missing a real big picture. Maybe in the short run, you can make some of those determinations, but I would argue that if we choose the environment over the economy, it's only going to be a short term, and vice versa. If we choose the economy without considering the environment, that's also going to be a short term, because, as I argue, we need a strong economy to continue paying for the environmental improvements that we've come to expect and appreciate. But we also need a clean environment, safe drinking water, clean air, safe disposal of waste, those things, to make sure that we can continue to attract the modern day workers, employees, entrepreneurs, and location of facilities that we want to have that are going to support those jobs, that support that ability for those environmental improvements. And so I think Texas has done a great job of recognizing that those are not choices that we make exclusive of one another, but we actually have to consider both. And I would argue also that, frankly, if you look at the track record, that we've seen that occurring. We've partnered with a lot of stakeholders, industry, environmental groups, public at large, and we've gone a long ways toward getting some of those huge reductions. Hector was talking earlier about 80% reduction in NOx in the Houston area. That doesn't just happen. That takes a lot of work by a lot of folks. And so we've seen that occur, and we've been able to do that in a way where we've worked with our industry, worked with our stakeholder groups to find ways that we could survive that economically. And so I'm not quite as optimistic as EPA often is with regard to their assessment of what impact regulations have on job creation or lack thereof. Some of the things that you look at from EPA whenever they come up with a new initiative, new rule, a new regulation, they tend to somehow think it's going to actually create new jobs as opposed to being a burden that's going to make it more difficult for jobs to be created. I don't share that same viewpoint, but as you'll see as I get into some of my points in a moment, we're doing what we can to make sure that protecting the environment is done in a way that is in combination with recognizing those needs for economic improvement and growth. I'll start a little bit about some of the impacts of regulatory policies, EPA and TCEQ on the Texas economy, primarily talk about some of the federal rule I'll give you as an example, and how that's impacting some things, and gives you an example of the approach that we take as we look at developing initiatives, as we look at implementing federal initiatives. And that's trying to make sure, as I like to put it, that we do our homework. We try to make sure that we go through the process to identify what those regulations have to be, what they can be, how they can work, so that we identify the unintended consequences and avoid those negative unintended consequences as best we can. But that means we have to do our homework. That means that we have to get to a point where, as I like to say, we can look to stakeholder groups, and that's the industry, that's the environmental community, that's the public at large. We can look those stakeholder groups in the eye and assure them that there should have a reasonable expectation that those environmental regulations that we're proposing, adopting, or amending, that there's a reasonable expectation that they're actually going to create the environmental benefit that our goal is aiming toward, and do so in a way that minimizes those unintended consequences. I think that is necessary not only from the standpoint of is it the right thing to do, but I think it's also important because we as a state agency have to maintain our credibility. We have to make sure that people trust us when we say that we've gone through the analysis. We need to make sure that's real. Sure, we make mistakes, but contrary to what you might read in the papers, I don't think it's because we're corrupt or because we're dumb, but sometimes that seems to be the common prevailing theory. I think if you actually look into these issues, what you'll find is oftentimes these issues are very, very complex, and we do a very thorough job of trying to balance those trade-offs that are there. And obviously there are a lot of people that will tell us when we get it wrong or when they see things differently. One such issue that I think highlights where we sometimes differ with our federal counterparts is the action that EPA has taken with regard to our regional haze issue. If you're familiar with regional haze, states are required to have programs in place to ensure that they are returning Class 1 areas, those pristine parks and what have you that you have, back to natural levels of visibility. So it's not a health regulation, it's one that has to do with visibility so that you can enjoy those vistas. You can see the Guadalupe Mountains, and you can see the Wichita Mountains in Oklahoma, and what have you. And so those are, for those Class 1 areas, a requirement that you have plans in place to reduce those, to return those visibilities back to the natural levels. And it is recognized largely that those are very complicated and challenging issues, because those are largely not just affected by what's happening within the state or neighboring states where those occur. A lot of those issues with visibility degradation also have to do with natural events and or transport from overseas sources, which are beyond our ability. I keep checking, but no, we don't have the ability in the state of Texas to regulate what comes in from Africa and other places. So we have to deal with that. Texas, we have 2 Class 1 areas, the Big Bend National Park, and I mentioned the Guadalupe Mountains National Park earlier. We also have requirements from the standpoint of our regional haze issues to address impairment in the Wichita Mountains in Oklahoma. And so part of the process that we have utilized and the EPA requires is there's a BART analysis, or best available retrofit technology controls analysis that has to go in place to ensure that you're on track. Well, EPA has posed, not to get into the weeds too much, but some of the other regulations, specifically CARE, the cross-state interstate rule, cross-state air interstate CARE, cross-state, what is that? Clean Air Interstate Rule. If you don't know this, there's been CARE, CASPER, and there's going to be some other version of that. So I apologize for getting the acronyms crossed there. I'm like many other regulators and bureaucrats now. I found that I know what the acronyms are, but much more than I know what they actually mean sometimes, or what those words are. So I apologize for that. But EPA made determination that CARE, which was the cross-state rule at the time, was appropriate and didn't require analysis to be occurring, and so we were in that place. Well, that went away, and then we had CASPER, and then we sued EPA, and we won on CASPER, and so there's a lot of things that are jumbled there. But the bottom line is our analysis of what we need to do for attaining the natural levels of visibility in the Wichita Mountains and in Guadalupe Peaks Mountain, as well as the Big Bend area, doesn't meet the desired time frame that EPA has. And we're not the only ones. In fact, if you look at recently approved programs in California and Arizona, some of their approval times where they would achieve those natural levels, in Arizona, there's one, for example, in the year 2700 and something. So that's, pull out your calendar. If you've got a calendar that goes through the year 2700 and something, you're planning a lot further ahead, probably on the order of the planning that my daughter does. She's 12 years old in 8th grade, and not to get too far astray, but 3 or 4 years ago, she shared with us that she learned that one of the items on her bucket list she wasn't going to be able to do. We adopted her from South Korea, and she discovered that being adopted from South Korea, not being a natural-born U.S. citizen, she couldn't be president. So I didn't realize she had that on her bucket list, but apparently she did, and so she'll be one of those that are actively campaigning to change the requirements for citizenship. You can insert any of your current election jokes here with regard to whether or not there is a requirement that you actually be a natural-born citizen and what that means. So anyway, I digress. So as we're looking at this issue here, we're working with trying to ensure that we're able to comply with regional haze issues and making sure that we're doing so in a way that allows for compliance in a timely manner. The state of Texas, we have compliance that are this century, actually. I think maybe one of them moves over the next century. But California and Arizona both had some that were approved for a much later time frame. Again, planning horizon beyond what typically we utilize. But EPA didn't like the approach we used, not really, and this is where the courts, I think, have agreed and are stepping in. It wasn't just that they didn't agree with what we did, it's just that we didn't do it the way they wanted to. And that seems to be, unfortunately, one of the common disagreements we've had with EPA over the last handful of years, is that oftentimes, from my perspective, the analysis that they utilize when addressing our programs isn't whether or not it meets the federal requirements, but is more of a question of, did we do it the same way they would have done it or they wanted us to do it? And unfortunately for them, that's not what the requirements are, although sometimes we have to work really hard to get the courts to understand that. But in this case, I think it's pretty clear that EPA has limited ability to dictate once they delegate authority to the states. I want to put a fine point on some of the issues here, because part of what we try to make sure we utilize what we often refer to as the three-legged stool. We want to make sure that we're considering science, the law, and common sense to make sure that we're able to achieve those goals I talked about earlier, where the stakeholders can expect, have a reasonable expectation that our regulations are going to do what they're supposed to do. Well, part of that is we have to make sure that things make sense. And if you look at the regional haze issue, EPA had proposed a federal implementation plan. In other words, they disapproved our state plan and wanted to force us to do things the way they wanted with regard to regional haze. It was effectively going to require additional controls at 15 coal-fired power plant units at 8 different facilities, costing by their own estimates about $2 billion. So $2 billion for additional controls, and the amount of improvement of visibility, and remember, this is not a health-based standard, this is just visibility, ability to see vistas and long views and what have you. The amount of change that we were supposed to have that they were going to get by doing it their way instead of ours amounted to between 0.2 and 0.45 deciviews. A deciview is a measure of visibility. Basically, 1 deciview is the minimum amount of improvement that you can perceive in the human eye. So theoretically, with good eyes, I don't think mine qualify for that anymore, you should be able to discern potentially the difference between 1 deciview change in view. Beyond that, you can't view it or can't detect it. And so the amount that EPA was wanting us to spend, $8 billion, $2 billion, whatever it was to obtain an additional improvement in visibility that you couldn't perceive. That alone causes me some concerns, especially because I think we met the federal requirements to get there. And then further, if you look at the actual measured data that we see in the field, we're actually ahead of schedule in actuality. But EPA oftentimes has a hard time, I think, characterizing the importance of measured values compared to what's modeled. The thing about models is all models are wrong. Some models are useful. Some models are more wrong than others. And so you have to make sure that you consider that when you're thinking about regulations that have huge implications from a cost and from a health standpoint. And so there's a lot of cost that was associated with that. The courts, fortunately, have issued a stay and agreed that, I think it points to the fact that they agree that EPA has been overly prescriptive in what we're doing. And so I'm hoping that we can work to a more reasonable approach with regard to regional haze and our approach to ensure that we not only make progress toward that goal, but we do so in a way that doesn't saddle industry and the regulator, the ratepayers for those electric utilities with another $2 billion to absorb in those costs associated with that. And if you're familiar with the state of Texas, one of the great things that we have working for us that helps our economy to be strong is we have a competitive energy-only electric utility market. And that is that you don't get paid just because you're available to generate electricity. You get paid if you generate electricity and sell it on the wire. So you have to be able to bid it in cheap enough to get there. That's why utilities in Texas are much cheaper than they are in a lot of places. That helps us with our home utility bills. It also helps us with industry when we're looking at bringing in industry that may have a high energy requirement. And so part of the challenge when you have a $2 billion cost on coal-fired power plants with, I would argue, an unintelligible and undiscernible environmental benefit is that's a lot of additional cost to be borne either by those individuals that have invested in those plants and or those ratepayers that are going to continue to support it. So it's something that we're looking at and continue to work with to try to make sure we minimize that. So the next phase I sort of want to jump into is talking about some of the things that we're doing from the standpoint of our permitting and timeliness and trying to make sure that we're efficient and effective as we go about developing those regulations and permits that are protective but also allow for economic development that I talked about earlier. How many of you are familiar with our expedited permitting process and the AIR program? This is mostly to see if you're awake or get you to wake up your neighbor. All right, so the Texas legislature gave us a program starting in 2014 and basically it allowed us to utilize, to let a permit applicant pay to expedite a permit processing through the agency. There are some things that can be done in an expedited manner and some things that are mandated. For example, we have certain time frames from the standpoint of public notice and certain processes, certain times that we can't adjust, the legislature can, but that we can't adjust. But what we can do is try to make sure that the processes that we have to go through to ensure that the permits are protective, meet all the requirements, and go through that analysis, there's some potential for being able to put more resources to that, more personnel to that if we had additional funding. And the legislature allowed us to have a program whereby an applicant would provide funding and we would use that to either pay overtime for our staff and or to hire third-party personnel to go in and process those to get them to the point where we get to a decision quicker. And of course, some of the key challenges that I've wanted to make sure we avoided was making sure that that didn't just become a process where you get to the front of the line or where you pay the money but don't get anything out of it. So we wanted to make sure that we maintain the integrity and that we're actually accomplishing what the legislature wanted to. And I've got some numbers I'll share here that I think will help to give you a sense of where that is and where it's headed to. We do accept requests from the applicant, and they submit an application-specific surcharge, and I'll give you some range here. Ranges from $500 for permit by rule to $20,000 for a federal news source review. So it gives you a range of what that surcharge might be. And again, it's not a front of the line or a front fast pass. This is something that basically allows us to then allow our workers to do overtime or things outside of the normal business. So this shouldn't have a negative impact on existing permits. And as you look through those, I think this is sort of an indication of how that program is working. On the federal case-by-case permits, the expedited projects average, so if you go through that expedited processing as of 16th of this month, so it's pretty current data, it's taking about 318 days. If you look at what the LBB timeframes that they required us to try to shoot for, it was 365 days, so we're below that. And if you look at what's happening with our non-expedited, so our traditional projects in that area, it's 446 days. So we've been able to reduce it through that process, or you or the permit applicants have been able to reduce that time from 446 days to 318 days. With minor case-by-case, it went from 348 to 217. For standard permits without a public notice requirement, from 38 days to 20 days. With standard permit with public notice, from 84 days to 75 days. And for standard permits like concrete batch plants, from 103 days to 96 days, not as much improvement there. And PBRs from PBRs, permit by rule, from 64 days to 21 days. So just to give you a sense of that, this is based on 542 requests that we've had for expedited permit processing and 393 that have been issued. So that gives you somewhat of a sense of what that program's been doing and the success that it's been able to have. Talk about some other streamlining and some of the things that we're doing within the Office of Waste. Waste Permits Division is streamlining has some streamlining efforts underway. Specifically, I'll talk about the hazardous waste combustion. In January of last year, January 2015, EPA Region 6 delegated the hazardous waste combustor maximum achievable control technology program to TCEQ. And that delegation eliminated some of the dual reporting, dual reviews, and some of that, so there's some efficiencies there. And so after delegation occurred, we've been conducting outreach activities to make sure the regulated community understands how to take advantage of that. And part of what we've done, and the reason I want to bring this up, is we went through a lean process. How many of you are familiar with the lean process? Again, wake up your neighbor. If you aren't familiar with the lean process, I like to think of the lean process, because I'm sure you've all been through this. You lock people in a room, you give them some whiteboards and some sticky notes. This is probably not exactly the way the lean works, but to me they're the same thing. And you give them markers, and you basically say, I'm not going to let you out of here until you all work out your differences or come up with a better way to do something. And so, but we like in the government, especially the federal government, put a lot of acronyms to it, and so we go through a lean process. And we identify that. Fortunately, before they were too hungry or starved to death or ran out of water, some of the things that occurred were there was some checklists that came up to be able to standardize the process, and it's going to, I think, lead to some efficiencies in that process. Specifically, standardizing those checklists and spreadsheets for hazardous waste combustion, for the plan and report reviews, and the elimination of redundant tasks, which I always like to reduce those redundant tasks that are performed by the agency. So there's some success there, and I think it's going to streamline that process. And I think that it's important to know Louisiana is the only other state right now that has in place, as I understand it, some standardized hazardous waste combustion plan and report submittals, and we're trying to do something to where we have something similar to that, which will provide some additional streamlining. Should come online in fiscal year of 2017. So that's right around the corner. So, talk a little bit about some Resource Conservation Recovery Act Part B application. Again, not specific about that topic, but what we're doing and some of the things that we're looking at. In the Industrial Hazardous Waste Permit section of the Waste Permits Division, they created the RCRA Part B application checklist using the Microsoft Excel. And what I want to talk about with this is basically we were able to go through and create a yes-no spreadsheet that you can click yes or no to certain criteria that will reduce of all the, I think, 160,000 different potential combinations It will then streamline the application to make sure that you're only answering the questions you need to, but that you're answering all the questions that you need to, so we get complete applications. And that reduces the number of inputs from 1,400 down to 400. So it's a process that will help to streamline that process and ensure that we're able to get those complete in a more timely manner, and we can address those deficiencies early. And so we're looking at trying to find ways. That's what we used to call an expert system, where you guide people through asking those questions as if you had an expert sitting with you, and the result then spits out an approach that eliminates some of the potential missteps or missed opportunities for streamlining some activities there. And so that's something that has been recognized, and EPA actually is sharing that. So EPA likes the work that we've done in that, and so we're going to continue working for that. I'm going to move on to some things within the Office of Water. Our Water Supply Division, I don't know if you're aware of this, but we're trying to make sure as we assess water rights and make sure that we understand about water supply and some of those things that we're efficient. We were able this week to process one particular water permit that only took 11 years to get through the system. So that's not typical. Just so you'll know, 11 years is hopefully a long one. It was very complex. We're shooting for something much shorter. And in fact, with regard to creation of municipal utility districts, we established a list of required items to be submitted by an applicant to ensure the timely review and creation of those MUDs, those municipal utility districts. And by doing that, if we get all that documentation created, it can be deemed adequate and expedited, and therefore it can be completed in 120 days instead of the standard 180 days. So we're looking for areas where we can make sure up front that we've got something complete, that we've got the information we need. We can then move forward to be that more efficient government that everybody talks about and do things in a timely manner, which gives us an earlier opportunity to address questions and issues, as well as the opportunity for streamlining and processing of applications. Within the water availability issues from the streamlining on permitting, the Water Availability Division has conducted a review of the permitting procedures, and looking at rigorous tracking and project management has been implemented to make sure that we're identifying those more challenging issues, and then we're able to put personnel on addressing those issues earlier. It makes that process move. And so we're piloting a fast lane for those projects that do not require modeling, so that we can sort of separate out those that have fewer issues, so that we can put them in and have some staff dedicated to that and work through those in a more timely manner as well. So just again, another example of some of the ways that we're trying to make sure that we're doing smarter government. In the area of wastewater, recognizing the importance of water supply, and especially some of the innovative approaches, desalination being one, and specifically desalination of seawater. We've looking at House Bill 2031, which was adopted in the 84th Texas legislature, created a new chapter in our water code that was related to this type of desalination. And basically what we're doing is to establish an expedited process for discharge of those treated marine salt water when it converted to fresh water, needed to be able to dispose of that in the Gulf of Mexico. And so we've got a streamlined process when we know that there's environmental protections in place, and specifically we can move from 330 days of the permitting down to 125 days for waste resulting from marine seawater desalination that's going to be discharged greater than 3 miles from the Texas coastline. And I'm pretty sure that doesn't just mean we go dump it to Louisiana on the coast. I think that's 3 miles out from the coastline, not dumping it in our neighbors' backyards. So we try to make sure we're good with that. Reclaimed water in other areas, we look at the importance of water and trying to get more use and more efficient use out of water. So we're looking at trying to make sure, for example, with our industrial reclaimed water that has low-strength organic industrial wastewater, that it can be used for land applications on-site or even off-site, meet certain criteria, as well as being used for things like dust suppression and things on-site to help reduce the use of raw and or potable water. And so we're trying to make sure that we're utilizing some things that make sense, that are still protective of the environment and health issues. And we've issued over 200 authorizations in this program that have resulted both in time savings as well as water savings. So these are some of the issues from the standpoint of processing efficiency from the permitting and doing our job standpoint. I'm reminded, I've heard it attributed to the Marines, you may have heard it elsewhere, that due to the recurring demands to do more with less, I've heard it said that the Marines say pretty soon we'll be doing everything with nothing. If you keep doing more with less over now, that seems to be the natural conclusion with that. I think with the efficiency and the expedited component that we have with permitting, pretty soon we'll be giving you your permit before you ask for it. So that seems to be the natural conclusion, or it certainly seems to be what some articles seem to suggest already happens, that we give those out without providing due diligence in that. And I hope you don't think that that's serious, because we take very serious our responsibility to ensure review of those. We just try to make sure it's timely and find areas for efficiency where we can get to that outcome in a more time-efficient manner, to where we can ensure that our investments in environmental improvements are able to be afforded, because we have a strong economy that can continue to support those. I'll sort of wrap up my discussions talking a little bit about some of the issues from the standpoint of what we do and how we go about making sure that our regulations and that compliance is being incentivized and being followed. So some of our Office of Compliance and Enforcement. I'll share a little bit, and I'm not suggesting that before I came to TCEQ in 2007 it was different, but one of the things that I've tried to make sure that our enforcement folks have a good handle on, the philosophy that I think is important, is, for example, my first briefing on what was going on within the Office of Compliance and Enforcement, a lot of what the focus was how many dollars of fines were levied, how many of those enforcement cases there were, which are important information. That's important data to have. But one of the key things I wanted to make sure that while we need that data, we need to report that data, and I need to see that data, I want to make sure that our focus is not, are we doing things to make sure we maximize our penalty dollars that come in, but instead we need to make sure that our enforcement process is optimizing and maximizing the compliance with the regulations that we are administering. That's the sole purpose for us having a compliance and enforcement component, is to ensure that we're improving compliance with the underlying permits and the environmental rules and regulations that we have. And maybe it's subtle, but I think it's really critical, because if you're focusing on measuring something, you tend to think that's the objective. And so we need to make sure that while we measure those criteria that we need to report, we need to make sure that we're also doing what is often harder. In fact, it's usually harder to assess how effective you're being at meeting the underlying goal of improving your compliance, but we need to make sure we don't lose sight of that. And I think our staff has done a great job and continues to work toward that goal. And part of what we do along those same lines of doing more with less, or being more efficient, more effective, is we're trying to make sure that we continue to equip our personnel with tools, resources, and an understanding of the philosophy behind our enforcement needs. Things like the gas fine hour camera that we utilize, and a number of industry utilize, to try to identify emissions, especially the volatile organic compound emissions from facilities. While it doesn't quantify those, it does certainly give you an indication of where you need to go in and focus your investigations, or where you may have leaks that you're not aware of. And so it's a great tool to make us more efficient and to make industry more efficient at self-policing and working on those lines. And so we continue to strive to find ways to do that more efficiently, do that better, to ensure that we're able to meet those enforcement requirements, doing so in a way that encourages compliance. We do a number of investigations. Some of those, if you're familiar with us, those of you that are in the industry side of things, sometimes we show up, sometimes those things are triggered by complaints or what have you, and we investigate every complaint. When a complaint comes in, we first determine if it's a complaint that's within our jurisdiction. If it's not, we find out where the jurisdiction is, and we refer that to that state, federal, whatever that authority is, as well as giving the complainant information of contact to what that agency or that responsible authority is, to make sure that that ball is handed off cleanly. If it is within our authority, we take the steps that are necessary to investigate that, to determine if the data provided and/or data we can obtain warrants action. We take that, and then we also try to make sure that the complainants are kept apprised of that process. Sometimes that's somewhat frustrating for all parties involved. Sometimes there's complaints that we don't have authority to do things about. Some of the nuisance issues we don't have authority. Others, it becomes very challenging because we have to observe those things. And so sometimes complainants get frustrated, but we try to do what we can to continue to improve that, and certainly be responsive and try to encourage those permit holders, those entities that may be involved, to be good neighbors and to work toward resolving those issues. And so we continue. I talked about the hour camera, or the optical gas imaging camera that we utilize, and it's a great tool that I have a lot of a lot of, I guess, not necessarily pride, but a lot of excitement about some of the opportunities that can help, and I'm certainly appreciative of the efficiencies that brings. That we continue to look at some of the things that get moved around to try to address some of the safety issues. We received, as a result, if you remember the tragic explosion that happened in West, where the fertilizer plant exploded, and obviously there's been some interesting developments in that. But one of the things that happened in the wake of that, the legislature moved some of the Tier 2 chemical reporting, moved the Tier 2 chemical reporting program to TCEQ. And while we still don't have the authority to make those kind of assessments that you say, well, TCEQ is there, therefore an explosion won't occur. We have a more active role. We brought some of those personnel over from DSHS, the State Department of State Health Services. And now we're trying to make sure that we're not missing opportunities to make sure that those local planning groups and the fire officials and what have you, emergency planning groups, which is where the state of Texas has that planning for emergency response occur, making sure that they have the data that's needed so they can assess what those environmental and issues are associated with materials that may be stored on site. And so we're working to see if we can continue making that work well. I would say from the standpoint of, if you question whether or not the state of Texas does an adequate job with regard to an active job of trying to identify the protectiveness of our programs, we have some of the most heavily monitored areas in the world. In fact, you're sitting in an area that's pretty heavily monitored. We have over 500 individual pollutant samplers at more than 200 monitoring stations across the state. We process over 11 million data points a year, and those are with 115 different chemicals that are used, and we do that on an annual basis. And so we have a number of monitoring sites, procedures. We do a lot of mobile. We do a lot of investigation where we go out and grab samples, use canisters to pull samples for air quality and what have you, as well as water and other. So we have an extensive monitoring program, and we continue to reassess and make sure that we're applying those resources in the proper manner. Not all, sometimes if a investigation doesn't lead to a notice of enforcement or an enforcement action, some people think we've not done our job, but I'll point back to part of what I talked about earlier, that three-legged stool, and our attempt to try to make sure that our programs in general are effective, that we're doing things that are legal, that have common sense to them, and that are supported by the law and common sense. And sometimes that's not easy to do, but we certainly try to make sure that, again, that incentive and that primary focus is on compliance. And along those lines, we do still have our Audit Act component, which a number of people take advantage of, whereby individual facilities can go through and audit themselves and identify issues they may have and clean those up, and they're provided a couple things, one being limited evidentiary privilege, so there's some protection from the evidence that's there, and then immunity from penalties. And so we look at, and I certainly have been a big fan of, if we can do things that will allow us to get to a compliance component as opposed to just always looking at how do we get the most penalties, I think that's a useful thing. Obviously, penalties do serve a deterrent component, and so they are important, and we rely heavily on guidance from the legislature about setting what the appropriate levels for those are. But we recognize that in order to really get the goals that I think Texans want us and require us to be doing, our ultimate goal is making sure we're encouraging and incentivizing compliance and finding ways to make sure that we identify those problems as soon as possible, because the state doesn't give us enough resources that we can be everywhere all the time. And so sometimes making sure that we enlist the regulated community to have encouragement, incentives, and benefits of doing some self-policing, additional self-policing can pay dividends. And so just wanted to give you a snapshot of some of the different things that are occurring. Obviously, there's always room for improvement, and part of the reason I wanted to share some of the things that we're doing is because not all the good ideas come from Austin. I recognize that we have, we're the second largest environmental agency in the world behind the EPA, and I don't know if that's something to be proud of or something to be ashamed of, but we have a number of employees, and a number of them are located in our 16 regional offices, and they're very talented. We try to make sure they're well trained and that they're well equipped, and I think they do a great job, but we recognize that if we're going to ultimately turn over every rock and identify every opportunity to make sure we're doing things better, then we need to not be closed-minded with regard to where ideas come from. And so I often encourage people, as you see perceived or real issues from the standpoint of efficiencies that may be gained, I'm certainly happy to hear those, and if they meet the requirements and we can find a way to make those occur. Oftentimes that leads to some of the programs like what I described, where we're trying to do things more efficiently and effectively and maintaining that balance between a strong economy and a clean, safe environment. So with that, I thank you for the opportunity to visit with you this morning. I don't know if there's an opportunity for questions. I'm certainly willing if you have time, but if not, thank you so much for the opportunity this morning to sit down and visit with you.